Welcome to Talks at Google. I'm excited and honored to welcome our guest today, author Quan Huynh. We will discuss redemptions, second chances, the criminal justice system, and creating change. He will speak on his work with Defy Ventures and his recent book, Sparrow and the Razor Wire, Finding Freedom from Within While Serving a Life Sentence. Without further ado, here's Quan. Hello, Quan.
Hi, Fizz.
Great to have you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
It's a remarkable opportunity to share this platform with you and to spread your story because it really is a really unique story.
Thank
I've
you.
been reading your book over the past couple of weeks, and I want to start by sharing that it's an exhilarating experience going through your book. It's so well written, deeply insightful, and the storytelling is truly suspenseful. What action are you hoping your book inspires in the world today?
I'd like to change the narrative of what it means to be formerly incarcerated, like change the face of what people think of when they think someone that has gone to prison, especially for a violent offense. I think I'd also like to just have people believe that every human being has the capacity to change.
Wow, it's powerful stuff. Before diving into the meat of your book, as soon as someone goes to your website, they see the following quote: "I was not born a murderer." Tell us more about that. I want to understand how you grew up, your relationship with family, and in particular, talk to us about how conversations with your father shaped your life.
Sure. I grew up in Provo, Utah. Our family settled here in the United States right after the fall of our country. And my father, who was a military officer in Vietnam, he had come to the U.S. before. My mom had never seen snow. So when we lost our country and they were looking for where they want to settle, my father said, okay, let's settle in Utah. So yeah, there we were, Vietnamese family, Roman Catholic, and we settled in Provo, Utah. Now, my father, oh, go ahead.
Well, they have snow in Utah, so your dad found the right place.
Yeah. Uh, so my father, like I said, was in the military academy. Um, so when I guess he was always been a social activist, he created what's called the Vietnamese Refugee Association, and it was him trying to find a way to help our new the new people get. Oh, that's really that our neighbors running their lawnmower right now. Yeah, he what he was doing, he was trying to help new displaced refugees adjust to their new homelands.
Wow. And in your book, you wrote about these trips that you took with your father in the mornings and some great conversations you had on these trips, how he really instilled the value of community. Would you like to share some of that?
Yeah, sure. So, like I said, my father, he worked full time at the coal mines, but then he created the Vietnamese Refugee Association, and this was to help like new families in the United States. So we drove to like neighboring states like Wyoming, Colorado, Arizona. He did he and as a boy, I didn't understand why he was doing this because he said he wasn't getting paid for it. So I didn't understand like this was boring. We're standing in these long lines at the DMV. He's just filling out paperwork. But I just enjoyed being on these car rides with him. Since I was the oldest, I got to travel with him, and we'd be gone all day. I get to ask him a million questions about life, and he just answered me. And that was where my bond with him really grew.
Wow. So in your book, you spoke extensively about how at a certain point your life took a turn and you joined a violent Vietnamese street gang in California. So, given the backdrop that you've painted about your family and kind of your upbringing in Utah, how did you like? How did your life take that pivot? What circumstances took you down a path of gang violence?
Yeah, sure. So, of course, being in Utah, it's a wonderful place. But I did experience what I do now know to be racism. So, I experienced quite a bit of that while we grew up, and a couple incidents that really left a mark on me. I never really felt like I fit in Utah. My father gets diagnosed with leukemia, and we moved out here to California because his condition was getting worse. So his family was out here in California. We moved out here to Cali, and this was my first time going to school with African Americans and Hispanics and other Asians, and in particular Vietnamese kids. And with the Vietnamese kids, I also didn't feel like I fit in because many of them teased me for not speaking Vietnamese well and said I was whitewashed, and I just didn't feel like I really fit in with a lot of my peers growing up. My father ends up dying from leukemia when I was 13. Um, and yeah, his death really tore our family apart because leading up to it, all of us, I'm sure we're praying for my father just to be alive. It was like right before our first communion. And I remember thinking as a little kid, like, yep, our first communion, we're all going to get to pray. And we're going to ask God to let our father live. He dies on the morning of our first communion, and in my family we didn't talk about it. There was never any talking about how do you feel about this. It's just that beginning of what we're talking about like now, toxic masculinity, wanting to be strong, thinking it's okay that if I don't cry that I'm strong and I'm okay and I'm going to get better. And that's what I believe because adults around me told me, yeah, you're just like your father. You're a strong kid. And I definitely didn't feel that way inside, but that's what happened. And within 4 years after his death, I was arrested for the first time with my younger brother. We went to juvenile hall, and that began a long road of me going in and out and getting even more involved with the criminal and gang lifestyle.
What role did juvenile hall play in your development at that time, and how did that take you more towards the gang violence, or give you an opportunity to correct yourself? I'm trying to understand the correctional facilities that we have for young children who are troubled, because I'm sure that your story is not unique up to that point.
Yeah, the juvenile halls, well, I think just the institutions in California, it's split up by race. So when I went in, I'm Asian, so I'm told you're hanging out with the Asians, and so that's how it's split up. So I'm hanging out with other Asians that are inside prison, and or inside juvenile hall, and that's basically where my core beliefs of becoming a gang member were formed, because inside it's like, okay, this is your group, this is where you belong, and never really feeling like I fit in my whole life. Suddenly, here's a spot that, oh, I think I fit in here. I fit in with these guys, and they accept me, and we have to protect each other. And so that just tied right back in with my beliefs growing up that I have to protect my family.
Got it. So, would you say they extended a sense of belonging that really filled something that you felt was missing at the time?
Yeah, a sense of belonging, acceptance, and even in jail and prison, it's that sense of recognition also. Unfortunately, we get recognized for violence, but then I realized early on that as long as I'm inflicting violence on people, then no one's going to victimize me. So, and plus then I get liked for it, and it's just becomes this pattern that I get sucked into.
Yeah. Now, I'd like to shift gears towards the day of the murder that put you behind bars for a life sentence. I can only imagine how difficult it may be to recall this story. So, to the extent that feels comfortable, Can you please tell us about the day you committed murder?
Yeah. So it wasn't just that day. It was leading up to it. Just my pattern of, and it was just my pattern of how I dealt with emotions. Um, my pattern of how I just didn't talk about things and just thinking that, okay, um, I'm okay. But when things happen wrong in my life, instead of being able to vent or talk about my feelings, I take it out on people. Like being in a gang gave me, in a weird sense, a socially acceptable way to vent my emotions. Whether that's getting into fights or getting involved with shootings, and that's just how I believe that it was okay for me during the during my gang time. Um, I had been turned down for leading a few months before the actual murder. I was turned down for a management position at the Gallup organization. I had interviewed there, and they brought it up for me to interview for a management position. And about a month and a half later, it came back and they told me basically their exact words were, "You are not a fit." And that's just the way they use their words. But for me, it just rocked that core part of me, thinking I don't fit in. See, even in society, I still won't fit in. I didn't
Mhm.
talk about it, didn't share it with my family or my girlfriend at the time. I just shoved those feelings away. Went to a nightclub within a couple of weeks with some of my gang associates. Some of them got in a fight, and I put into action following these guys. I wasn't even involved in the fight, but I wanted to. Here's an opportunity for me. I might feel like a failure in this part of my life, but in this part of my life, I know how to succeed and be recognized. And here's a way for me to vent all these emotions that's going on inside. So we followed them for about 20, 25 miles, and then I shot and killed one human being by the name of Min Nguyen in the car and injured two of the other three passengers. And that's when I was arrested. And I was arrested a couple months after that and was tried for the death penalty and ultimately given a life sentence, 15-year to life sentence, and sent up to prison in California, which basically meant a death sentence because at the time, California was not paroling any life-term prisoners.
Wow. And, of course, right now we're sitting back and thinking about something that happened years ago. But as you were going through this on that day or a couple days following, what was going through your mind? Did you get arrested kind of on the spot, or what were the events that happened afterwards, and what was going through your mind?
Yeah, I think the investigation took about 4 or 5 months before I was arrested. They found out like our gang was involved in some way and started doing the investigation. In my mind, when I found out, I think it was the next day I found out someone had died, and for me, I just, okay, I have to get rid of the gun. I have to get away with this, and I don't talk about this to anybody. And I just try to go back to my day to day living with like this suddenly. Deep, dark, ugly secret that I'm holding on inside, and I don't talk about it.
Can't even imagine what the weight of that must feel like. And talk to us about your emotions kind of as you transitioned into the prison system. What did you feel and what were your thoughts?
Yeah, when I went into the California prison system, I'm ashamed to say that I had no true sense of remorse. For me, I justified the shooting as, in my mind, okay, well, it was my life or theirs. This is what happens when you're in the wrong gang. And every excuse I can make up in a book to make myself not feel like that bad of a person. Um, since I had a life sentence and since I thought I was never going to go home, I just figured, okay, well, if I'm gonna die in here, I'm gonna live the way I want to live. So I came into prison just still living the way I wanted to live, still involved with the criminal and gang lifestyle inside prison, and in many times perpetuating it upon others too.
Your book is titled Sparrow in the Razor Wire. Can you explain this metaphor and why you chose this title?
Yeah, about 10, 11 years into my prison sentence, um, I started asking myself like certain questions. A few things had happened. I think around that time, my niece had passed. I mean, my niece was born. It was my younger brother's daughter, and I got a picture of her. And this is like the first time I'm seeing a picture of this little baby and looked exactly like my brother. So it took me right back to just childhood. And I'm thinking like, how did I end up here like this? Around that same time, also my grandfather passed away. It was my father's father. So then that same question of what would my father think? Like, how did my life end up like this? I think right around that time, I'm doing a life sentence, and it was right around the time of I was thinking, you know what, my father died around this time of in my age, and look at what he had created in his life, and yet here I am, his whole path of like love and helping others, and then my whole path of death and destruction. Um, I've always been a bookworm also. So throughout my prison term, I've always found escape by reading. And I'll read about one book or another and then go to the acknowledgments, especially if there's a book that I really enjoy or an author. I'll go back into the back acknowledgments, look at what other books influenced them, go down these rabbit holes of just exploring different themes that interest me. So I'm not sure how I ended up on uh, these books, but I was reading books on business books and about biographies of certain business people, and then somehow I stumbled on these books of the saints, and in particular stories about saints that had failed in some way or another in their lives, but then yet transitioned and turned their lives around, and of course left these amazing legacies. So from there, I get fascinated with the saints, then books on spirituality, mindfulness, and then go down these rabbit trails on personal responsibility and everything. And it just became like this perfect storm in my mind and my heart, where I was one day on the prison yard standing by the fence. And then I just remember asking myself, like, why do I have to view prison as punishment? Why can't this be a place where I just remake myself, even if I'm supposed to die in here? And I realized that I could. And just that small, subtle shift in my thinking, it made all the difference in the world. I was standing there. I remember the sun was barely coming up. I could feel its warmth on the blades of grass right near me. I could see the individual drops of dew. And up above me in the razor wire, I heard a sparrow chirping. And I tell everyone, like, I heard them chirping my whole prison term. I mean, I never heard them chirping my whole prison term, but that day I heard it. And I would have to say from that day, prison was no longer this cold, harsh, ugly place. It became a place where I felt like I could remake myself, and I could look to change myself one day at a time, one choice at a time. And that's just how I began to approach each day of my life in there. Journaling, each night saying where I failed that day, what could I improve on, practicing a lot of principles that I was reading about in these books about people that want to communicate effectively, and what is personal responsibility and accountability, and all these themes that suddenly fascinated me. And here's the perfect place for me to practice all of it each day. And so that's just how I approach life in there.
Sounds like it really feels like an inflection point that shifted your perspective. And it's remarkable that you got to experience that moment that led you to where you are today. It's one thing to decide to want to change and transform. It's another thing to actually go through with it. And I think the most remarkable part of your story is the fact that you remained consistent and you remained committed and you went through with it. And I'm sure that some individual kind of habits that you developed helped you with that, but I'm sure that relationships that you've developed also kind of supported you in that journey. Would you mind elaborating on any of the relationships you formed in prison that helped you on this path?
Yes. So another thing I forgot to mention is like right around this same time, um, I I I I checked in with a therapist, and the therapist, and this is the first time I'm talking about my father's death. What 20 odd years after he passed away, it's the first
Wow.
time I'm able to openly talk and begin this grieving process, um, and and it's only because I ran into one of now I say my great friends, Donnie, who had sat down with me one day, began talking to me after I had gotten in trouble again, and it was like he was sitting there. And it was just a guy that we all knew on the prison yard. Oh yeah, this guy helps people become their better selves or whatever it was. But I remember just making a joke because he was African American. I made a joke to one of my friends who was sitting with him. Because at the time I think they started barely paroling lifers,
Hmm.
and then I had told that guy Todd like, oh, does Donnie only help black folks go home? He doesn't help Asian folks. And then so I guess Todd told him. So that's when my first conversation with Donnie. Donnie told me, so I hear that you think I will only help black folks go home, and that's where our friendship began. But he sat down and started having me examine my life. So he came in at the perfect opportunity. You know, like when they say, when the student is ready, the teacher appears. So Donnie was the perfect teacher for me at that moment. A bunch of books were the perfect teachers. The community around me, like men in prison that were already on this path many years before me that I never saw, suddenly they're right there for me to learn from, pick their minds, and in process begin to refine my own mind.
As you think back at, those teachings you got from Donnie every time you sat down with him, what's the biggest learning you can reflect back on today that you still carry with you, or that you kind of convey to other other prisoners if you ever meet them or speak to them today?
Uh, that's I love that question. Donnie always drove into me. He always said this: "You ain't got it unless you're giving it back." And he continued to say this all the time: "You ain't got it unless you're giving it back." And that was what drove me in there. When, like I shared about the seeing the therapist and then getting involved with grieving my father's death. Of course, being the bookworm, I suddenly get fascinated with books on grief and loss, and I began reading all books on it, becoming fascinated with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model, and then noticing grieving and men mourning all around me, but not having a way to express it. So I actually put together a syllabus, submitted it to the prison psychologist who loved it, and we created the prison's first ever grief and loss group while I was there. And that's when I felt alive for once, and suddenly there's meaning in my life. And that's when I realized this is what Donnie means by "you ain't got it unless you're giving it back." And I began to start to give it back, getting involved with other groups, creating other groups, and suddenly that's the way I lived out the last 4 or 5 years of my sentence before I went to the parole board, and they just told me, we don't feel that you're no longer a threat to society. And they let me go home in November of 2015.
Wow. While you were in prison, leading up to kind of your parole, you started talking about this a little bit. You were a very productive member in your prison. Could you talk about some of the impact you may have had on individuals there? I believe you were involved with multiple people kind of going through their parole journey and had a lot of conversations about being accountable for your actions and owning up to your actions. So could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, and in the California prison system, each time a life prisoner goes to the parole board, um, they are issued a parole hearing transcript. Um, Around this same time, one of my friends decided to let me read his parole transcript, which was very rare. Like nobody shares their hearing transcripts in prison, and it's like very looked down upon to even ask for it or anything. Like people don't talk about it. he had 7 parole transcripts, which meant he went to the parole board 7 different times and was denied each time. And when I read it, he had told me multiple times what happened in the parole board. But when I read it, it made me realize what he told me what happened in there and what really happened were 2 totally different things, like 2 totally different things. And it's almost like this narrative or this script that is in human nature to put the best spin on things. And it made me think to myself, like, what narratives or what script am I telling myself that's actually not true, that I'm making to make myself feel better. And of course, that's where I got really fascinated with books on personal responsibility and understanding like that whole dynamic with it. So I sit down with my friend, and I go, as I was reading, I go, I think I know why he's not able to go home. And it's not the parole board, it's him. It's the way that he's saying these things and he's not owning, and he hasn't come to this place of personal responsibility. So I was sitting with him and another friend. Some people on the in our day room saw us sitting there together with transcripts out. So they asked one day, like, what are you and Quan doing down there? And my friend tells them, oh, Quan is going to help me at the parole board. And of course, everybody laughed. They said, how can Quan help you when he has never been to the parole board? And for me, it was like, no, I think this is what's happening. So my friend, one of my other friends that was also sitting with us, goes to the parole board and is found suitable. And suddenly that opened up all the floodgates where the men go, Quan knows something here. What is going on? So then people start sitting with me to basically coach them to prepare for the parole board. I know most of them wanted to sit with me because they want to go home. And I was fine with that. But my thing was, you know what? I know, and I feel like I know this amazing secret of like freedom already inside my heart, my soul in here. And I just want to share it with these guys around me. And it feels like I'm crazy because nobody is really listening. So I want to be able to help them in this way. Yes, they're sitting with me because they want to go home from the parole board, but I want to sit with them and hopefully shift their mind and their heart in a way so that they can say the right things when they go to parole board. But regardless if they go to the parole board and are released or not, I'm hoping they find the same inner freedom that I've already found and discovered in here. So that was basically my agenda in sitting with each of them, following of what Donnie had said, like giving it back. Because by that time, Donnie had already gone home. He was found suitable and went home. And basically I was there and I go, this is how I could still honor and live up to what Donnie had given me. And this is the way I can do it.
I mean, what you're describing, Quan, it's not easy work because it's not like you discovered a cheat code that anyone can go in front of parole board and find a shortcut for leaving prison and entering back into society, right? This is not that at all. But
no,
you were
I used to
coaching
tell the
them,
guys,
you were coaching them about accountability, ownership, and how their actions have affected people, right? So I'm curious if you could elaborate on how you went through that journey yourself. I remember you have a chapter in your book called Conversations with My Mother, and you shared a couple of stories about when your mother used to come to prison and visit you and some strong conversations you've had with her. And you mentioned to her that you didn't just end one life, but you affected countless others. And you think about the mother of your victim a lot as well. So the process that you're talking about, it's not overnight, it's not easy. So could you share some insight into what that looked like for you?
Yeah, so for me, of course, when I got involved with the groups and creating other groups, one of them in particular that I was really fascinated with was this one that we was involved with. It's called Victims Awareness. And a lot of it, of course, me going down these rabbit holes, I got really fascinated with restorative justice principles and figuring out a way to provide healing for both victims of crime and the offenders the offenders themselves. So when we created these groups or when I was facilitating these groups, it dawned on me, these men also need healing. These men also need to come to a place of, self-acceptance and self-forgiveness. And then I realized I also have to come to that. And that's what it became for me. How can I begin to forgive myself? And it wasn't like you said, overnight. Even once I started facilitating these groups and helping men here and there begin to go home. I remember it was inside one of these workshops I did, and there was this exercise. It was called "Who Am I?" We write on 10 slips of paper, "Who are you?" And one word descriptions. And one of my 10 words that I used to describe myself was murderer. So I had 10 slips of paper, and during the exercise, they asked us to drop the slip of papers. And when it came to that murderer, they said, drop it. And what would this feel like if this was no longer part of your identity? What would this feel like if you no longer embodied this? And that's when I realized, why am I still holding on to this? Why am I still not forgiving myself? And that's also preventing me from healing. So that was my own personal journey. And this is years after I began facilitating some of these classes. And coming to that realization, I also realized the men around me, very many of them were also in that same boat. So yes, there's accountability in this, and there's personal responsibility and our choices, but there's another huge component is just self-acceptance and self-forgiveness, which I think is in a lot of our nature. Is it's easier to be harsh and be unforgiving of yourselves, and it's hard to just accept and to love yourself. So that's what I also began as I sat with these men for the board, what they call board prep. For me, it wasn't just board prep. It was let's change this person's whole heart and mind, regardless.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that. Sounds like your workshops were extremely impactful. Would you like to share anything about conversations with your mother?
Yeah, I'll share probably one of the most difficult conversations with my mother. It was right before I went to my last parole board hearing. My mom had come in, I think probably a few months before my hearing, and she was very concerned about the hearing and just asked hey, I'm really scared. I don't know what's going to happen. Which to me, it felt, this doesn't make sense. She still doesn't grasp the way I see things. She still doesn't understand. And I knew, yes, of course she wanted me to go home. But then that's when I had to tell her, Mom, you do realize what I'm in prison for, right? And then she says, yes, but you've done enough time. You should go home. And so I just had to ask her, I go, Mom, what if that night I was the one that was killed? And now here it is, 15, 16 years later, I'm dead. You go to the parole board hearing, and the guy that killed me is sitting there, and he tells you he's sorry. And he's sorry for killing your son, but he's involved with groups, and he's a better person now, and he's facilitating groups. Would that make up for the child that you brought into this world? And of course, my mom cried, and she said no. So that's when I had to remind her. I go, let's just be grateful that I'm alive and that we get to hug and spend time with each other, because there's another mom out there that doesn't get to do this because of me. So you have to remember that. I think that's where my mom's perspective began to change also.
And a remarkable testament of how you changed over the years. Could you imagine you saying any of that in your first day when you walked into prison?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. First day going in, it was more like, that's what happens. I have no sense of remorse when I first came in.
You, my friend, are just one of the most, remarkable change-making stories that I've had the pleasure of understanding and getting to know, and kind of also provides hope to many others who are looking to change themselves, looking to transform. And it's great to see that, after, at the end of that transformation, even though nothing was guaranteed, now you are a productive member of society, outside of bars. Talk to us about how you eventually got paroled, because it took you multiple attempts, and as you mentioned earlier, when you started off in prison, it's a life sentence is like you're there for good.
Yeah, several things happened. So historically, in the state of California, a life-term prisoner had not been paroled since 1977. Not one single life. So whether a person has 5 years to life, 100 years to life, life without the possibility, nobody was going home. In 2007, a landmark ruling came down. It was a woman prisoner that had argued it up to the Supreme Court. What's the difference between a life without possibility of parole sentence and a life with possibility of parole? The courts agreed with her, and then they came out with these they called factors of suitability and factors of unsuitability. So factors of suitability meant a perfect prison record, like no prison write-ups, never been arrested, no previous violence, higher education, like all these things where they said, okay, if somebody like that, then they may be able to be found suitable. So I saw people that fit that bill. Most of them had been in prison upwards of 30 years, were in their 60s or 70s, never got a write-up before, all of this. And then they had the other list, factors of unsuitability, multiple arrests, violence during incarceration, and all these other things. And I fit under every single one of those. So even when that ruling came down, I saw, I go, this doesn't apply to me. And I didn't see it happening to anybody going home. But then as more people began to get found suitable, like my friend Donnie, even after the parole board found him suitable, they were not releasing him. The governor, because it's politicized, would just pull the date and just say, no, we're not going to parole him. He has to argue it, and they have to fight through the courts. But then right around the time of my change, I started seeing, wait, I think people can. And I started understanding more of the parole process. I think this is more what they're looking for. Especially now, people the courts are examining this. I think this is what they're looking for, actually. And a lot of it was very similar to restorative justice principles. So that's why I was just able to help some of these men. And I think over that time, I helped maybe 10, 12 men get found suitable at the parole board, which is not an insignificant amount. But there were many more men that sat down with me, but it wasn't easy. Like sitting down for an hour a day, a week, and sometimes we'll 2-3 times a week, and we'll do this over 4 weeks. Some men will just say, no, I'm not going to go through with this anymore, and they can't go through with it. Or very many will just sit there for a little bit and see that it's a lot harder because, like you said, there some of them were just looking for the magic words to just go to the parole board and abracadabra, they get to go home. But it wasn't that. It was a lot of hard internal work and a lot of hard challenges with self-acceptance and all that. So I think when I went to the parole board, it was my second hearing. I thought for sure I was going to get denied. But when we went in there, the commissioner was very harsh to me. I just spoke the best way I could. And, up to that point, like I saw everything that I had been practicing in groups and everything I wanted to embody as far as communicating effectively and using I statements and everything. It was not working with this woman every way. And I just was resolved, okay, I'm getting denied today. Now it's just a matter of how many years she's going to deny me. My attorney also saw that. And she had told me we went out for a restroom break, and she told me, you know what, this is not fair. We're gonna postpone this hearing. I don't feel good right now, and we're gonna go back in there, and I'm going to say that I don't feel good, and we don't have to continue the hearing, and they'll put this off on the calendar, and 6 months from now you'll be able to come back in. For myself, when she told me that, I knew that I, if I did this, if I made this choice, then I was not being true to what I'm saying about personal responsibility. So that's when I told her, look, I was here to hold myself accountable. I was not here to be found suitable. Let's just go back up in there and finish the hearing. We went back in and finished the hearing, and after the hearing, they came back. They just said, we found that you are no longer a threat to society. And that's when they ordered me released.
Wow. What a story. So at the end of the day, it wasn't, listening to your lawyer or trying anything formulaic, really just sticking to your truth, and the transformation that you went through is really what got you out.
Yeah, I would have to say so, yes.
Now we'll transition to audience questions in just a couple of minutes, but I'd love to ask you about your work after prison. After coming out, you started doing remarkable work with an organization called Defy Ventures. Can you tell us more about what they do and why it's important?
Yes, Defy Ventures is a nonprofit that helps men and women with criminal histories transform their lives through the journey of entrepreneurship. I got involved with them when I was in prison, stayed involved with them when I paroled, created my first company 6 months after that. And when they expanded out here to Southern California, asked if I would be interested in joining their team. And I did. So, so now I work as the senior program manager for the entrepreneurship programs. I see now working with them, my father, I can see like I get to be in the same position that my father was in a certain sense. My father was helping refugees and immigrants transition to their new lives in this country. And I get to help returning citizens transition to their new lives out here in the world too. So I think it's still embodying what Donnie had always taught me, right? Like, you ain't got it unless you're giving it back. So I still get to give it back.
It all comes full circle.
Yeah.
Now, how can other people get involved with Defy Ventures? I know that there's multiple Googlers who are involved with that organization. Could you elaborate on what others on the live stream can do to learn more about the organization and also contribute?
Yeah, they could go right to our site, and they could learn about Defy Ventures. It's www.defyventures.org. They could go into prison with us. They can, they could. There's plenty of ways they could get involved. I mean, we have post-release programs that they could get involved with. We have teams at Google doing a bunch of tech stuff with us too. So there's a whole bunch of ways that they could get involved with us.
And if people want to learn more about your story, how can people connect with you or find your book?
They could find my book right off my website at quanxwin.com. Or if it's easier to spell, you could go right to sparrowintherazorwire.com. They can find it on Audible, Amazon, and anywhere where books are sold. And if people want to connect with me, I'm on all social media at Quan Huynh.
Awesome. Great. Well, I'm sure you'll get some pings right after we end our live stream today and throughout the week. With that, I think this is a good time to transition into audience questions, if you're okay to answer a few.
Sure.
Great. Our first question is from Tam Nguyen. Love that you found therapy helpful. Will you tell us more about the journey of learning to express and process your emotions in healthier ways?
Yes. Great question, Tam. I shared previously that I checked in with a therapist. And to give you context, in prison, it's not socially acceptable to really talk to a therapist. It's looked down upon, or it's seen as weak. But I felt it was essential for me. It was in therapy and speaking about my father's death for the first time and beginning to mourn it is where I realized it was his death that this first big block of this wall that I built up, and everything else on top of not wanting to feel emotions or feel hurt or feel sadness or any of that. So removing that first block right there, and then seeing what else I built up about my life, like about my identity, and how else did I shut off my emotion from the world, all of that. So yeah, the inside therapy is where it began, and then processing emotions and getting involved with groups and practicing, books on emotional literacy. And I go down that rabbit hole and reading, becoming fascinated with books about that. And that's where I began to practice. And then feeling more alive, especially with other men on the yard that are also on this journey, and being able to talk to them about emotions and beginning to talk about how or upbringing and things that I put up about myself after affected me in very toxic ways, and then how I can begin to address it.
Thanks for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Next question from James Driscoll. Quan, how can people be inspired to reform prisons and reimagine justice? The problems in the prison systems feel overwhelming. It feels like the current approach is out of sight, out of mind.
Yeah, well, I guess that's where I get to plug in DeFi Ventures again, because that's part of the work that we do, is transforming the narrative of what people say about prison, and bringing people into proximity of people that are incarcerated. Because I think it's just about hearing each person's story. Yes, it's not only about out of sight, out of mind, but it's many times someone can come home from prison, have already finished their sentence, and then we at DeFi Ventures all know that they basically begin a second sentence because employers won't accept them. Maybe family members or neighbors won't accept them. So it's all of that tied in together. So to reform prisons, that's a huge pill to swallow. I mean, a huge one to figure out. But I would say it can be done. Is just figuring out ways to bring healing for both victims of crime and offenders that are incarcerated. Get them to that place of figuring out how to make amends and yeah.
Thank you. Leslie Ann Bergstrom, thank you for sharing. The sparrow has religious symbolism, and you mentioned being raised Roman Catholic. Curious what part, if any, religion or spirituality had in your journey.
That's a religion and spirituality was a huge component in my journey. I would have to say I rejected any sense of spirituality or my faith after my father passed away. And it wasn't until I began my own process of transformation that, and reading books, first with the saints, and then becoming fascinated with books on spirituality and the teachings, is when I began to go back and read the catechism and scriptures in the Bible. And I would have to say, I realized a lot of this all tied in together, the basic fundamentals of just treating people right, like reading books on spirituality or Buddhism, the Quran, all of that. For me, it just felt the basic principle is to treat people right around us. And that's what I would have to say I began to embody. So I choose to practice my faith in the Catholic Church. But for me, I would have to say it encompasses, not the doctrine, but just being able to say, this is what I feel comfortable practicing. But for myself, it's just treating everybody on my path as a human being and connecting with them.
Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome.
Sage Moon, after you had done so much work to transform yourself, how did you navigate social stigma and barriers for people with past convictions? How did you stay positive and ultimately succeed?
Hi, Sage. Love the question. So, how did I navigate social stigma? Well, I think at first it was challenging for me also because coming home, I remember some family members saying, "Nah, don't let people know where you went to prison for." I remember going to my grandma's house and my uncles not even knowing. No, I think my uncles, from what I remember, heard the story that I did not commit murder, that I was just in a group and that I was not guilty or something like that. Um, and having to tell them for the first time, no, that's not true. Like, I went to prison for murder. Um, I would have to say the first 6 months, a year after release, I felt conflicted inside because I didn't talk about my past conviction that much. There was a part of me that felt like I was betraying the men that I left behind because I didn't talk about it. But there was another part of me that felt ashamed because I had this past. And another part of me felt I'm not being genuine and authentic. And I missed prison in a way, in a sense that because while I was there, I could openly talk about it and I could openly share because people knew what I was in prison for. So it took me a while out here. And I think once I realized going back to what I knew that was helping me in there, following my gut and going with my intuition, is when I go, you know what? I don't care what society says about people with criminal histories. I want to talk about it and I want to share my journey because I don't think I should be defined by that. So that's just I don't know. It ties perfectly with my work at Defy and why I love working there so much and what I get to do.
Awesome. Next question from Lauren LeBouf. What's one lesson you would give to your younger self?
One lesson I would give to my younger self, and maybe that would be maybe one lesson somebody could have said to me would be just asking me how I'm feeling. So really wouldn't be a lesson, but just to ask how I'm feeling, especially after my father died. So I guess, I don't think, I'm not sure if somebody telling me back then, oh, here's the lesson you need to learn. But I think if somebody just asking me how I feel and holding space and giving me the space to talk about my emotions and going through it and letting me know like it's not healthy to hold these emotions in. So maybe that's the lesson.
Solid advice. Next question from Janet. Thank you for sharing your story so openly with us. Was there any particular support you received when you came out of prison that helped you transition?
Yes, I would have to say it was being involved with reentry organizations like Defy Ventures. That was helpful to still be in a space where I could kind of start to talk about it and not feel like I'm an outcast out here.
And you had started your own business after prison as well.
Yes.
Correct?
6 months after I got out, I started a commercial cleaning company with I have 6 employees today. 4 of them are also formerly incarcerated, and I have to tell everyone like those are by far my best workers too.
You practice what you preach. I love that. I think those are all the audience questions for today. I have one last question for you before we wrap up. Imagine that 14 or 15-year-old Quan, the one who was working at a sandwich shop before all of this went down. Imagine if he used a time machine to come to the year 2021 and see what you have done, what you've transformed into, have read your book, heard your story. What reaction do you think that Quan would have seeing you today?
I would have to say I think he would he would look up to me and he would ask me questions.
I think he'd be really proud as well.
Mm.
Thank you so much for bringing your true self, and not only to this event, but really to everything that you do. We really appreciate you sharing your story, being so open with your journey. A lot of these things are very difficult to talk about, but we all have a lot to learn from your journey. I think you had told me once that we're all in prisons of different kinds, and that stuck with me because as I read through your book, there's so many different things that we can learn and take away as we all try to improve, correct, and change to whatever our long-term vision may be. So thank you, Quan. We
No,
appreciate
thank
you.
you so much for having me.